Greetings, friends. Operational situation at the front on the 28th of January. We will start with you, according to the tradition of the Skopinski-Lemensky direction, with Sinkivka. North of Sinkivka and eastern Sinkivka, without any changes, I mean by the gray zone, and west of Sinkivka. Active hostilities continue, where Russian troops are trying to advance and gain a foothold in the forest for a flank attack, which we talked about before. Yesterday we also talked about this on the evening broadcast. Further information is being received today, which means that the Russian side is actively continuing attempts to gain a foothold in approximately this area. And accordingly, from the estuary of the First, there are attacks in the direction of the railway in the south direction, that is, in the southwest at the First Alaman, and in the south along the road, in order to stabilize the front line relatively well, and try to implement an attack from two directions here, since the frontal assault did not bring the desired success. According to the Pristravnev-Ivanevka, without any changes. According to Tebayevka, information on the front has already been updated today. So, the enemy managed to capture Tebayevka. What they reported yesterday, we were waiting for further confirmation from our side. Unfortunately, it exists today. On a front section up to 2 and 7 kilometers wide, Russian troops advanced to a depth of up to 2 kilometers. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today. According to reports from the AFU fighters, Russian troops are conducting offensive actions in the direction of Sandy and in the direction of Berestev. So, in the direction of two settlements, from Tebayevka and from the Starch district. As you can see, not only Tebayevka has come under control, but also the neighboring Beam, and in fact it is being used as a springboard for further offensives in the southwestern direction by Russian troops. At the same time, here we pay attention to what is located to the south, that is, Sandy, Birch Bark. But there is also Kotlyárovka Kislavka, which is also now under increasing pressure from Russian troops. We talked about Ivanevka Yagodnaya, that there are also attempts from the Russian side from Yagodnoy in the southwestern direction to probe the defense of the AFU, but there is also some activity of Russian troops in eastern Kotlyárovka. Actually, they are aimed at these two localities. Ahead of them, if we are talking about Tebayevka, there is a rather serious obstacle that has passed into the gray zone. A large fortified area, which in its size is actually larger than Tebayevka itself and Starch combined. It is also visible from the satellite of this fortified area, and it is now in the gray zone. If the enemy manages to capture it and gain a foothold accordingly, then the question naturally arises of their further offensive actions on Kotlyárovka. At the same time, we are talking not only from the south or northwest. For example, Russian troops will strike south of Kotlyárovka, but also east of Kotlyárovka itself. I repeat, there is some activity of the Russian troops now. It has a positional character, but this positional character, and in general, the transfer of those forces that were carried out by the Russian troops, for what we said on previous broadcasts, that they will continue the assault operations, this suggests that they will naturally go further. But in order for them to go further, it is necessary to align the front line here, and this is just the same Kislavka-Kotlyárovka that they can potentially attack. Well, and another beam from Starch to Rate. That is, approximately this area will also be targeted by Russian troops in the near future. The situation is difficult, it is enough in this sector of the front. Someone makes predictions that the next target is Sandy, in the direction of which there are also attacks. We have already talked to you. And actually the main goal is to reach the Oskol River, so to speak, divide the AFU forces in two, and move in the direction of Kupiansk, from the southern flank, so to speak. Well, we'll see. To date, we state unfortunately, the loss of Tebayevka. We do not record any new changes in the Lyman direction. If we are talking about the round beam, footage of the presence of the AFU in one of the forest belts was published, just in the claw of the round beam itself, so the gray zone can most likely go into the zone of control of the defense force, but it still needs to be fixed. In any case, in the previous days, it was possible to drink Russian troops and relatively stabilize the situation. Although in this sector of the front, also, if we proceed from the number of attacks, what forces the Russian troops have concentrated, we can naturally predict that in the next few weeks, they will continue active offensive actions in the direction of the settlements of Terny and Yampolovka. We do not record any significant changes, as well as in the Seversky direction. In the Bakhmut direction of Bogdanovka, without any changes in the positional nature of the fighting. On the southern flank, there is a clarification in the area of the abandoned Artemovsk airfield, between Ivanovskoye and Kleshevka. We have talked about the previous days that Russian troops are pressing here on this sector of the front. But then they spoke southwest of the Chernobyl Garden Association. Well, actually, clarifications have been made for this section of the front. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today. Added gray and red zones. The red zone is what happened to us a few weeks ago, where Russian troops dug in. I am referring to the abandoned Artemovsk airfield. And the gray zone is what we said a few days ago, when there was an attack by Russian troops on a neighboring forest belt. From where they were subsequently knocked out, they were not allowed to gain a foothold. But still, Russian troops in this sector of the front are very active, and are aimed at both the forest belt and the forest plantation north of the Kleshayevsky fortified area. We do not record any other changes in this sector of the front. We are moving to the Avdeevka direction of the northern flank. We said yesterday that there was some activity in the previous days. If we take a few days, the defense forces even managed to dislodge Russian troops from one of the forest belts. At the same time, we also talked with you that their pressure is now concentrated in the direction, conditionally, of Novobakhmutovka and the Zarya Garden Association. Fresh footage of the Russian attack was published just the same in the direction of Don. Within the gray zone, Russian troops were stopped. They were pushed back to their original position and attacked along the railway. But a very big bet is being made on this garden partnership now, in order to have the same favorable relative to the opposition as in the Takmash Garden Partnership, from which there were further offensive actions on Stepovo. In other words, here is an attempt to take basements, in which, unlike open fields, it is naturally more efficient, let's say, to dig in, linger, safer from drones, from discharges, and well from artillery. Therefore, there is such a moment, and the enemy continues to try to attack him. We do not record any changes, except that the activity on this sector of the front is quite high on the Russian side. According to the standard, without any changes, according to the Garden Association, and 2 years, without any changes. Here, Russian troops expect that another group will be able to break through from Vizly to the south, gain a foothold along the forest belts, and not one but two. Our main one is the central forest belt between the Garden Partnership and Kamenka, and it would allow us to have more stable flanking positions and further attack in the south direction. This is what the Russian troops are aiming at now, in order to break through to it as much as possible and try to gain a foothold. Well, or simply put, align the front line to stabilize the flank and go further to Avdeevka. In any case, the APU manages to repel a fairly large number of attacks on this sector of the front, so we do not fix any changes. But the enemy does not leave attempts at this. I will comment on a few points on the southern flank. We have said that there are active hostilities between the positions of Russian troops occupied in the area of Staroya Avdeevka in its southeastern part, and Yasinovotsky lanes, active hostilities within the gray zone, and Russian troops are naturally making attempts to gain a foothold in a number of positions in this gray zone. And some clarifications have come. They managed to advance to a depth of about 280 meters in a section up to 500 meters wide. Active hostilities continue in this sector of the front, and the main goal is, of course, to take the Garden Association Dubravo, its basements again. Well, the impact vector in principle looms in the direction of the sand quarry, I mean, although Erika Skotovada passes here, but this is already such a moment. As for the southern part of Avdeevka itself, there have been no changes here for the last few days. There is a lot of talk about it, but without any visual data. In fact, there are very heavy fighting going on, the heaviest I would say how. I will not exaggerate, and I will tell you as it is, as we had in Bakhmut, because this is already, as you understand, an urban type of battle, when there were fighting in the smell of mutka, that is, in the private sector, active combat operations with the Wagner PMCs, and actually, we have about the same situation here. It is typical street fights, the hardest. The fighting cannot be said that the Russian troops have made significant progress over these days, because the situation remains dynamic. That is, attempts were naturally made to gain a foothold and move as close as possible to the railway, well, or to the intersection of Chernyshevsky or Sportivnaya streets. It is possible to discard them somewhere in this area, but here, as they say, it is too early to talk about anything, because such a type of battle, like Bakhmut, needs to be looked at in the context of 1 or 2 weeks really. Therefore, we do not record any changes here, except for the dynamic situation. Well, as for the gray zone area, pressure from Russian troops including, will continue here. I think so. Let this be my opinion. There is another garden association just the same, along the highway T0505, and in the direction of this garden partnership, Russian troops will definitely attempt to advance, that is, to go beyond the railway within the gray zone. But this is how I see it, that is, they will try to bypass the fortified area of Chebarashka in this way. But we are already saying, this is the most pessimistic scenario, and it seems to me that in the middle term, they are in a short time. Therefore, active hostilities continue. As for May Day, according to him, as you can see, for the third day, there have been a lot of reports that there are also active hostilities in the settlement itself. And this information, unfortunately, corresponds to reality, in the sense that the enemy is conducting further assault operations along Voroshilev Street, along Sadovo, the remaining part of the Garden Association. Well, and also about northwest, I would probably say already, west of Izmailovsky Stavka, in the direction of Proshravneva Street. That is, attempts are still being made by Russian troops to cling to the building, and, accordingly, to gain a foothold in it. Therefore, there are active hostilities here. The situation is being clarified due to the fact that the dynamic remains in this sector of the front. We do not record any new changes in the Kurikovsky direction. Fighting in the eastern part of Georgievka, as well as an attempt to advance in the neighboring forest belt in a northerly direction, but without any changes. And we will comment on Novomykhailovka. So, in recent days, we have already started talking about it, that the enemy is trying to break through the gray zone again. And the AFU fighters published footage, in fact, where Russian troops made another attempt to attack in the direction of Novomykhailovka, with the support of armored vehicles. We managed to stop them, this assault group, but as you can see, they do not give up trying to advance in this sector of the front. They attack periodically to the east, then to the southeast, to the south, even to the southwest. And there are attempts to advance south of the Menagerie fortified area, approximately in the area of 2 T-shaped intersections. Therefore, there is a fairly high activity here, but without any changes. It is possible to restrain Russian troops in this sector of the front. This is the general situation we have at the front. In other areas, I mean the Orekhovsky section of the front, to the market, without any positional changes. The fighting persists. Activity is very high, and it can also be predicted that active offensive actions by Russian troops will continue on Novomykhailovka, because, as at Avdeevka, here they need to level the front line, stabilize it, which would allow some troops to be released from a fairly wide section of the front. Quite large forces are concentrated here, well, and switch to relative positionality in some areas. And most likely, based on the fact that the forces were Smorinka, directed just the same in the direction. Conditionally we will say Novomykhailovka, that is, south of Mariinka, in the area of the fortified Menagerie and the neighboring fortified area. Attempts to advance gain a foothold. Naturally, if these troops are released, they will go to Georgievka. There is such a moment, and accordingly, victory in the same way, Only if there is a more stable flanking position. They can naturally strike from 2 directions, or even try from 3, from the south, from the east, and from the north. There are prerequisites for this, but this is the most pessimistic scenario, because the situation is quite complicated. As it is, so it is. Somewhere, as we see, it is possible to restrain the enemy, but the main goal, as everyone has already understood and voiced by Stoltenberg and others, is that this war has gone to exhaustion. A turning point, who is running out of reserves, ammunition. Logistics is deteriorating at the site due to drones and so on and so on. In other words, it is in the classic form of a war without deadlines, namely attrition. What was once laid down in his time, that it should be avoided. And the enemy, in fact, is trying to impose it on the entire front, attacking in the Kapitsko-Lemensky direction in the same way. That is, continuing daily attacks in the Lemensky direction, I mean the thorns of the Yampilovka. There are still a number of sites that we are already talking about today. This is sandy, birch bark. In other words, there are several settlements of Kislovka, Kotlyárovka. These attacks, which last about a week, they have a positional character, but as you understand, they are attrition, because the enemy is trying to cut off logistics with drones, and of course, having made the most of the supply roads. Therefore, there is such a moment, a difficult situation, a very, very difficult situation at the front today. They asked me to comment on the news background, but let's leave it for the evening broadcast, where we will play chevrons with you, as I promised already for the evening, and I will answer all your questions. For the evening broadcast.